we're talking late 90s here. I would go on auditions and it was always like, oh, can you do that again with an accent? And I would always say things like, oh, sure. What kind of accent do you want? I can do Irish, Brooklyn, Scandinavian, German. They were never amused by this, by the way. I was like the shit-eating 22-year-old who was trying to school them. They're like, why don't we just stick to Indian?
It's Mayim and Bialik's breakdown. She's gonna break it down for you, because she knows a thing or two. And now she's gonna break down. It's a breakdown. She's gonna break it down.
Mayim and Bialik's breakdown is supported by One.
I just learned that banks charge Americans $34 billion a year on overdraft payments. That's $160 for every adult American. People, you're being bilked by banks. Yeah, they'll lend you the money if you go over your balance, but then they charge you $30 or $35 for the favor, even on tiny overdrafts. Jonathan, you and I both have personal experience of banks taking advantage of us. What if people want to get even? They should switch to One and enjoy no-fee overdraft protection. Also, no minimums or membership fees, unheard of 3% APY on direct deposits, and that's 3% versus their 0.04% on direct deposit.
One actually cares about their customers, and their service is so much better than traditional banks.
You'll also get a $25 bonus when you use your One card. For full details, visit onefinance.com/break.
That's onefinance.com/break. One believes in rewarding customers, not gouging them. Mayim and Bialik's breakdown is supported by Athletic Greens.
I use Athletic Greens every day. Why? Because I want to make sure that I fill in all the blanks in my diet, because I often eat on the run, I eat late, I'm stressed. What is it? Well, one delicious scoop of Athletic Greens gives you 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, whole food source superfoods, probiotics, and adaptogens to help start your day right. Jonathan, people need to reclaim their health. Let's arm our immune systems with convenient daily nutrition, especially in flu and cold season. One scoop in a cup of water every day. That's it. You don't need a million different pills and supplements to look out for your health. Athletic Greens is going to give you a free 1-year supply of immune-supporting vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. What do they have to do, Jonathan?
All you have to do is visit athleticgreens.com/breakdown. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/breakdown to take ownership of your health and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance.
Hi, I'm Mayim and Bialik, and welcome to my breakdown. This is the place where we break things down so you don't have to. Today, we're going to be breaking down the happiest man on the planet. But before we introduce Kal Penn, I'd like to introduce you to the second happiest man on the planet, Jonathan Michael Cohen.
Hello, Mayim. I'm only happy when I'm with you.
That's not true.
I should say I'm only this happy.
That might be true. So, Jonathan, how are you doing today?
I'm laughing because you asked me this last time, and I had this just sort of confused look on my face because I was like, why are you asking me? I'm fine. What are you talking about? We just spoke right before the podcast. Why are you asking me this? I thought the goal was to get into the interview as fast as possible. But then you explained to me, you were like, no, you wanted to do a check-in, like a mental health check-in to see, oh, is there anything going on with you? Because that's a great thing to model. And I was like, oh, I'm going to remember that I'm going to prepare something for the next intro, but then you just asked me again, and I didn't prepare anything.
That was Jonathan explaining.
The good news is, though, I think fast on my feet, and I remembered why you asked me that question just now.
No, you just procrastinated for 2 minutes.
I've had a lot going on. There's been a lot of uncertainty I've been dealing with. I had a suspicion about something happening, and people will later hear that in the podcast, Kal Penn is like, think the best of a certain situation, which is very good for one's mental health. In my situation, I did not think the best, but what I thought was accurate. Someone was acting in a way that I knew to be sort of over the line. And
do you want to know why I'm laughing, Jonathan?
Why?
Because the thing you're talking about, I already knew. Everybody knew what was going on but you. That wasn't you pretending to think the best. That was you was having your head in the sand, or cup and tuchus, as we say. It was your head in your tush.
Enough about me, though.
Let us talk to author of You Can't Be Serious, Kal Penn. Now, Kal Penn is a many hyphenate person because you may know him from the Harold and Kumar franchise, the franchise of films starring two people who he was told would never get to star in a movie, two Asian Americans. He is one of them. People from South Asia are Asian. And also, he's been on House, Designated Survivor. He also, this is one of my favorite facts about him, he won MasterChef Celebrity Showdown.
We didn't even talk to him about if he's a good cook.
He is a good cook, and he's from New Jersey. He went to UCLA, which is my alma mater. He went at the same time as I was there, but did he mention me in his book? No, he did not. Did he mention Jaleel White? Yes, he did. Did he mention he's friends with Jenna Von Oy, who played Six on Blossom? She's even in his thank yous. But could he mention that I went to UCLA? I also worked with him on Big Bang Theory. He had a really, really funny recurring role. I guess it was our last season. And he also Kal Penn served as Associate Director of the White House Office of Public Engagement. He was President Obama's liaison to young Americans, Asian Americans, and Pacific Islanders and the arts community. He worked on a range of issues, including the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the Affordable Care Act, Pell Grants, arts and culture programs, the DREAM Act, and rapid response to the BP oil spill and the earthquake in Haiti as well. He's one of those people who he balances many things. But the difference between people like me who balance a lot of things and him is that he has an incredible temperament. I'm very, very fascinated by this person. Let's welcome to our breakdown, Kal Penn. Break it down. Kal Penn, welcome to our breakdown.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm going to go ahead and hold your book up because it's time
Sure,
to.
yeah.
So this is your book. That's right. I have a signed edition and I'm not afraid to show it. Your book, You Can't Be Serious, taught me so many things about you. And I knew some things about you.
Sure.
And we worked together on Big Bang Theory briefly, but it was really fun. And one of the things I learned about you is your full name is actually Kal Penn.
Yeah, my full first name, Kal Penn.
So it was pronounced Kal Penn.
Kal Penn or Kal Penn, depending on who's pronouncing
Which
it.
is the right pronunciation?
The actual way to pronounce it is Kal Penn. The right pronunciation is Kal Penn. Yeah.
Kal Penn.
But Kal Penn is sort of the anglicized pronunciation. And so just like many names, like Joseph, Kal Penn became Kal. And so when I was coming up with a screen name, which we both went to UCLA around the same time, although we did not know
I
each
noticed
other.
I'm not mentioned in your book, but if you want to get into it.
We didn't know each other. We didn't know each other. So I remember in the dorms, my freshman year, probably towards the end of my freshman year, none of my friends were theater or film students. And so they were all always just really kind of perplexed that I would try to be on this path with absolutely no promise of job stability. Because they were like, either finance majors or accounting or something in bio, a lot of South Campus. Mm-hmm. And so one night at like 2 a.m, they're like, you should come up with a screen name. So many actors, it's screen name after screen name. I'm like, what do you mean? Like, well, like Whoopi Goldberg. Like, that's not her name? They're like, no, think about it. Her name is not Whoopi Goldberg. Her name is Karen Johnson. And she came up with this incredible screen name. And could you imagine if she didn't? Like, she would just be far less memorable. Chevy Chase, his name is Cornelius. So anyway, so we went through all of these. They talked me sort of into it. I'm like, yeah, why not? Give it a shot. What should my screen name be?
And tell us your given last name.
My given last name is Modi, M-O-D-I.
Which is a very sweet little name.
Thank you. These guys were like, what about Kal Pacino? I was like, yeah, I see what you're doing there. I'm not going to call myself Kal Pacino. So we ended up I just thought, well, what if I just split my first name in half? Kal is already a nickname. Maybe Penn is the 4-letter last name instead of Modi. And I had gotten headshots right around that time and like new
very
headshots.
Handsome. Your headshots are lovely.
They were it is in the book because it's such a ridiculous.
It's fantastic.
Late 90s headshot.
And I'm sorry, you added another N because you thought a 4-letter last name was better than a 3-letter last name?
No, the joke that I use is the extra N is for not going to play a stereotypical cab driver.
I've been encouraging Mayim to get a stage name. I think she could break through to a larger audience if she Americanized.
Your name is so badass.
I don't know.
I also think just I'll never know if it was, having a more Western sounding name or a catchier name, or some people were like, oh, it's like two different universities. Like, who knows? That was,
Oh, I didn't even think of, Kal Penn.
Yeah.
Very Ivy League of you.
But I do think what's interesting now is, like you said, like the idea of coming up with a screen name is, it's not about that anymore. It's like, what can be the most unique? Right? Like the 2022 version of a screen name is like, what's the craziest, most unique, standout?
Look to what everyone's naming their children, and you will learn what is the most unique. But also, your given name is, for Western eyes and ears, easy to pronounce.
Sure. Yeah.
Meaning, even your given name, in theory, I could mess it up, two different ways. Whereas with names like mine, it literally is. You can mess my first name up about 5 different ways.
Yeah.
And my last name, just about as many. So I win, sure. Is really what I was. You have a really beautiful American story.
Thank you.
You have a really rich family history of a lot of community and connection and camaraderie. And, anyone who has had South Asian friends or spent time in a South Asian community knows it's a very, very large, extended community and family. And you paint that portrait really nicely, the notion of, having just like everyone is kind of your aunt and your uncle and your cousins. And everyone really has equal rights to lay claim to your existence.
100%.
Like it's very, very, very intimate. And you paint this kind of portrait of like, people who otherwise wouldn't know your most intimate decisions about life, like right up in your face, along with your parents.
And they're invested in it, the what we call like the auntie and uncle circle, right? So it's people who share an immigration experience with your parents. You're not related by blood, but everybody is an auntie or an uncle. And they're like in your business in a way that, like, they need to know, like, where are you applying to college? What grades did you get? What did you get on your SATs? And they're not asking for you. They're asking for them. Like, it needs to be up to their level. Like, if you even, like, look, even the kids who were saying that they wanted to, be doctors or engineers, it was like, even that was like, what kind of doctor? Because I think that you should be, right? And then they would rattle off, like, I think you'd be good as an oncologist. Or someone else is like, no, pediatrician is really your game. I'm like,
you're the person who should tell people they're dying. That's the face.
Right.
Jonathan, what does this sound like?
I mean, a lot of our culture is very similar. I was supposed to be a doctor, lawyer, or an accountant.
Mayim and Bialik's Breakdown is supported by BetterHelp Online Therapy.
If there's one thing Jonathan and I know, relationships take work. Especially the most important one that you can have in your life. No, not your relationship with your podcast partner. Your relationship with yourself. A lot of us will drop anything to go help someone we care about.
They'll drive downtown. We'll
sit in traffic.
We'll drive
downtown 2 nights in a row. We'll sit in traffic. We'll pay a lot of money on an Uber and then be humiliated in front of our partner's closest, oldest friends. Oh, wait. Wrong podcast. A lot of us will drop anything to go help someone we care about. We go out of our way to treat other people well. How often do we give ourselves the same treatment? This month, BetterHelp Online Therapy wants to remind you you matter just as much as everyone else does. And therapy is a great way to make sure you show up for yourself. BetterHelp is online therapy with video, phone, and even live chat sessions with your therapist. You don't have to see anyone on camera if you don't want to. It's much more affordable than in-person therapy, and you can be matched with a therapist in under 48 hours. Give it a try. See why over 2 million people have used BetterHelp Online Therapy. This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp, and our listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/break.
That's BetterHelp.com/break. Mayim and Bialik's Breakdown is supported by ZipRecruiter.
According to the latest research, 90% of employers plan to make enhancing the employee experience a top priority in 2022. After all, a happy workplace is key to attracting and keeping great employees. Here are a few ways that employers can make their employees happier. Make employees feel valued, focus on company culture, offer more learning opportunities, allow for more flexibility in work schedules. If you need to add more employees to your team, there's ZipRecruiter. Their matching technology helps you find the right people for your roles fast. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free at ziprecruiter.com/break. ZipRecruiter's technology is so effective. How effective is it? 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day.
Find the right employees for your workplace with ZipRecruiter. Try it for free at this exclusive web address.
ZipRecruiter.com/break. That's ZipRecruiter.com/BREAK. ZipRecruiter.
The smartest way to hire.
You grew up in New Jersey.
Yeah.
You were born in New Jersey, correct?
I was, yes.
You grew up not only in a place, but also at a time when we as a culture, were still really learning what South Asians were and what South Asians weren't. You know, the notion of people from India was this sort of like monolithic like notion where like there's a lot of differences in culture, language, religion, practice, across across India. But you grew up in a place where you dedicate a really healthy part of the book to the bar mitzvah experience that you had. And also I will say, it sounds like you grew up in an affluent community, meaning the Jews that you speak about had bar mitzvah experiences that were very different, for example, than mine. They might have been similar to Jonathan's from Toronto, but there absolutely was something that I really identified when you spoke about your family. Tell us a little bit about growing up. Your parents are highly educated, very successful.
Yeah, my parents moved to the States. They were part of the post-1965 wave of immigration. And I always try to talk about this because it's the one thing that's lost. You're right. Like, especially back in the day when you would think of South Asians, but Asian Americans as a whole, we would think of them as this monolith, right? Like, oh, you're just from some general nebulous Asian region and that's all we know. And my parents' experience was that 1965 immigration laws changed primarily to allow people from Asian countries who were either studying or had a degree in things like engineering and medicine, because in America, we had a shortage of doctors and engineers. And so that's one of the reasons you see so many Indian American doctors or Asian American doctors or engineers. My dad's an engineer. My mom got her master's in chemistry. So that's what brought them to America. And they, my dad moved to America with $12 in his pocket, but his circumstance of immigration allowed him to sort of climb that ladder through hard work that a lot of other immigrants, that avenue is sort of closed no matter how hard you work. So I'm always mindful of that because you're right. The town that I primarily grew up in Monmouth County, is this affluent, very, in the book, I think I describe it as like, it was mostly a white town, but it was still diverse. And what I mean by that is like, most of my close friends were Jewish, so they had extended families, and it was like going to their houses for dinner was not unlike, my parents having all their friends over, where just the idea of what family meant. And then even, and so you'd also hear other languages spoken, right? And so we had friends who were Polish and Italian, and it just didn't dawn on me, like the idea of being bilingual to me growing up was always part of being American. It wasn't until after high school when I went to college that I was like, oh, wow, a lot of people are just not bilingual. And
there's so many white people who only speak one language.
Like they seem aggrieved by my ability to communicate in multiple languages. This is fascinating. But in Jersey in the 80s and 90s, it was having that aspect of diversity was very grounding for me. But also you still felt othered, right? Like we used to get picked on all the time. People would. In fact, this is one of the first things that drew me to understanding why things like representation in the media matters. I remember when you'd get your ass kicked in the hallway. At the time, that was not called bullying, by the way. It was just called eighth grade.
It's just called living, correct?
Yeah, right.
It's like not being cool.
But when the difference I realized between me and the other nerds was that when I would get my ass kicked, they would recite quotes from The Simpsons or Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, right? And I'm like, oh, well, that seems weird. Like, it seems like I would get my ass kicked anyway, but that added like icing of racism on that cake was something that I was mindful of, because it's those types of experiences that put you in check to know that, okay, people see me differently than the way that maybe I see myself.
Was that something that was spoken about in your home? Because, my parents are first generation Americans. And so there was this kind of notion of like, we seemed like we fit in. And obviously, having white skin, which not all, Jews do, but we do. We're Eastern European. There was this notion of like, always distrust whatever's happening out there. Like, they may turn on you at any minute, which is not a healthy way to grow up. But I am curious because you come from, and this is another thing we share in common. My parents were civil rights activists. So you also come from a family that lived through, seeing one of the greatest leaders for nonviolent protest in the world, as part of the consciousness of your grandparents' generation. So was that something you talked about, like that kind of otherness? Or was it like, just try and get by, fly under the radar?
I don't think it was fly under the radar, but I revered my grandparents. My grandparents marched with Gandhi and were active in the Indian independence movement when they were younger. And so the stories that I would hear, truly the stories I would hear as like an 8-year-old at the dinner table when they would visit us from India, they would stay with us for a few months out of the year. The like story that any grandma tells their grandkid to like coerce them into eating their vegetables, mine just happened to be about like the Salt March. And so I didn't, and so the 8-year-old me is like, ugh, there she goes again, grandma with another Gandhi story. All right. But as I got older, obviously by the time I was like 11, 12, certainly 13 years old, I'm like, oh wow, my grandparents were really part of something very special that was in many ways the basis of our own American civil rights movement and nonviolent civil disobedience. And so the family value in our house was just sort of do the right thing and make your voice heard if you feel strongly about something. It was never about politics. It was never about religion. In fact, being sort of Gandhi and freedom fighters, their view of faith was really open and really wonderful. And they would encourage me. They loved that I was going to bar mitzvahs every weekend. They loved that friends would invite me to like mosque or church or, whatever. They're always like, oh, you should go, there's only one God and different forms of worship and all of that. And so that was like, I really revered my grandparents. I don't think that meant that I don't think that had a say in like whether we were just blending in, staying quiet to fit in or not. But I do think that later in life, the idea that I had kind of a public service bug along with my arts, right? And trying to double major in college or going to grad school for international security and kind of doing both of those things. I think a lot of that influence was because of my grandparents.
But I'm curious, like, did your mother wear sari? Like, was she identifiable as different, let's say, as a woman? I know you were often asked, like, where's your turban? But you're not Sikh. Right. So I am curious, though, was there a blending in like that? Because it is kind of different for women, especially outside the Sikh community. Women are more identifiable if they wear sari or.
Right. Yeah. No, I never asked my parents directly, and I probably should. That's actually an interesting thing to maybe know. My parents, when they would go to work, would dress professionally for the job. I almost hesitate describing it that way because there's nothing wrong with people who choose to wear ethnic attire to their jobs, but
which we're not allowed to call costumes.
Right.
Like in the 70s, that's what it was called. Like, oh, look at that costume. No, that's just clothing.
Yes. I know, right? Exactly. But no, my dad wore a suit to work every day as an engineer. He took the bus into New York City. My mom would drive to. She worked as a fragrance evaluator for a perfume company. So she had this insane job where she would combine her olfactory senses with a knowledge of chemistry. On weekends, definitely when we would go to Indian functions or gatherings or have family friends over, people would wear, you'd wear a sari if you're going to a wedding, or you'd wear
we put on sweats on the weekend. Your mom would be like, I'm gonna put on.
Exactly. The less uncomfortable version of sweats.
That's fascinating to me. I love that. That's like her sweats.
You know what I think? What was interesting to me growing up, and I think part of this is because of the type of place I grew up, right? Like a suburb of New York City that was somewhat diverse or white diverse, was that it's a lot of South Asian immigrants or kids of South Asian immigrants. They feel, and they talk about this a lot, where they feel like they were trapped between two worlds, or that they had a foot in two different worlds, and that they were often being forced to ask to choose between the two. And I never really felt that way. I always felt very comfortable with, who I was and being multilingual, and, the things that I think can sometimes bother kids, like the food they eat at home or the way their parents talk, or what, the dichotomy of that versus what's happening in school. And I think one of the reasons I was fairly comfortable with that is I felt like an outsider within the brown community because I had an interest in the arts. So that was sort of the difference, where I think a lot of kids, to your question about whether my mom wore a sari or not, think for a lot of people, they point to experiences like that where they felt othered or they felt out of place. Or like, oh, someone's going to stare at my mom. In my case, it was the opposite, where I'm like,
They
I
were
just
all
feel
staring
like
at you.
they're all staring at me because I'm not trying to be a doctor.
Do you have siblings?
I do. I have a younger brother.
And is he also artistic?
He's not. He is not a doctor. He works in nonprofit, but he is not artistic. So I was definitely the weirdo.
Here's a question also, because you describe, in the book a very kind of patient persistence that your parents had specifically around academics. And, a lot of times when we think about a childhood like that, at least I assume like, gosh, that sounds stressful, or that sounds like oppressive, or it sounds like that would breed so much anxiety. Meanwhile, like, look who's talking, like I was raised like bathed in anxiety juice. In my family, or in many families that I knew growing up, it was a very, like, there was a constant like battle over like, why aren't you doing this? Or like, are you going to do this? Or, especially in families that actually could afford medical school or law school, which my family could not, it's this notion of like, you will do this. It's what's expected. It's what your father did. Like, or like my dad was supposed to be an accountant. As if it was like being the United Nations chief. Like, how could you not be an accountant, right? But when I read your story, what I hear is that there was this kind of persistent pressure, but there was a persistent expectation, but it also doesn't sound like it bred in you a tremendous amount of anxiety. It seems like it bred a lot of motivation to do what you actually wanted to do the way you wanted to do it.
I think it's less, so you're right in a sense where it was less about like the day-to-day anxiety that you're describing, because I think even if I wanted to be a doctor, right, or even if I wanted to be an engineer, the conversations at those family functions were like, where are you going to college? And then somebody would say, oh, I'm applying early to Yale. Where are you going to college? Oh, I'm going to Hopkins. I'm going to make, I'm pre-med. Where are you going to college? I'm going to BU. And then everyone would go, oh my gosh, she's going to BU. And then the girl who was asked would go, no, but for their 7-year medical program. And then all the aunties and uncles would like breathe a sigh of relief and be like, oh, well, that's okay. You can go to BU for that. So it was like, if you were so far out of that realm, I remember having people come up to me, my parents' friends, and they would say things like, you can't do this to your parents. You can't, you'll be homeless. You'll be, you think that you like this now. Acting is a perfectly nice hobby. Why would you throw your life away? And so it was less about the day-to-day anxiety and more about like, there was just a blanket, like we do not support or condone this. And I asked my parents about this actually. I put this in the little tag at the end of the book because it was the one thing I feel silly now. I'm in my early 40s and I had never thought about this, right? Like I called my parents because I tell the story in a longer way about the aunties and uncles and all that. And I called my parents and I was like, hey, of all the things I'm fact checking, I just need to, on a scale of 1 to 10, back in 8th grade, 9th grade, when this would all happen with the family friends, how embarrassed were you that I said that I wanted to be an actor and a filmmaker on a scale of 1 to 10? And both my parents said, we were never embarrassed. I don't know why that's in your head. We were scared. We just never thought that the arts were a viable career that somebody could have, especially not somebody who looked like us or came from our community. And so any discouragement that you felt was really based on our own sense of fear as immigrants. I just like, what a silly thing to not recognize.
That's also like to spend your whole life. I mean, like, some of us go to therapy forever about things like this. Like, how nice that they were able to correct it at a point when you can still have a productive life.
No, totally. It was a great conversation. But so I just feel like it wasn't. Look, the other thing that I say a lot, because you're right, is that like you have to be insane to be an artist. Period. Like if you're going into dance or screenwriting or acting, whatever, you have to be. There's a part of you that's crazy. And the toughest thing that you're going to deal with in terms of rejection for your artistic merits is like the rejection from producers and networks and going on 1 million auditions before you get one. That's like the conversation with the parents and the family and being shamed for being a doctor. That's nothing compared to like the real sense.
They were training you.
They were.
I mean,
right.
literally,
So,
my father would literally say that to me when I would run lines with him or when we would, and he'd be really critical. Well, how are you going to take it when they pick on you? I'm just trying to toughen you up. Thanks, Dad. Now I'm weeping openly.
Mayim and Bialik's Breakdown is supported by Native.
Let's talk personal hygiene.
Let's do it.
Do you have time to read the long list of ingredients on the back of bottles?
Heck no.
Right. Some ingredients I don't even know how to pronounce. If you're like me, if you care about what goes on your body, it's time to try Native personal care products like I did. Every Native product is thoughtfully formulated to keep you feeling and smelling fresh all day long. Best known for their aluminum-free deodorant, which I'm wearing right now, Native wants to help you practice safe sweats, which is why they keep their ingredients list bare naked, with ingredients you understand. When you visit their site, you can discover all their fresh scents and maybe even try out one of their moisturizing body washes while you're at it. I really love Native because since I started wearing deodorant, I have hated that the only choices were things with a ton of chemicals that just block your pores.
Also, people don't realize what you're putting on your skin is getting pulled into your body, and it has a big effect.
Totally. Smell and feel fresh all day long with Native. Get 20% off your first order by going to nativedeo.com/break or use promo code BREAK at checkout. That's nativedeo.com/break or use promo code BREAK at checkout for 20% off your first order.
Mayim and Bialik's Breakdown is supported by Ritual.
Gaps in the diet shouldn't be ignored. Ritual's Essential for Women 18 Plus multivitamin was formulated by exhaustive research to help fill nutrient gaps in the diets of women ages 18 and up. It's formulated with nutrients to help support brain health, bone health, blood health, and provide antioxidant support. Did Ritual stop there?
Heck no.
They did not. They invested in a gold standard university-led clinical trial to prove the impact of Essential for Women 18 Plus Multi, which was shown to increase vitamin D levels by 43% and omega-3 DHA levels by 41% in 12 weeks. Ritual is committed to third-party testing from USP and the Non-GMO Project. They use traceable and vegan-friendly ingredients, and they always have clear communication. No shady stuff. Right now, Ritual is offering our listeners 10% off your first 3 months. Visit ritual.com/breakdown and turn healthy habits into a ritual.
That's 10% off at ritual.com/breakdown.
You know, you had, I don't want to describe your childhood as uneventful because it was very eventful, but you found theater. You know, you found humor and you found comedy, and you found it in a way that was, in certain ways, kind of socially transformative for you.
Definitely.
And kind of to paraphrase, you kind of became like the guy who was the nerd is like the funny nerd,
Right.
and then it sort of, led to these different levels of kind of entry, into teenhood, and you went to UCLA, very far away from home, and you moved to Los Angeles, and your experience besides the fact that, again, you didn't mention me in your book, even though we were literally at UCLA at the same time, but I was in South Campus.
Yeah.
So, I didn't get up to your side of the world often. It's a public university. It's a diverse, student body. And by that, you have people of all different shapes, sizes, colors, sexual orientations, socioeconomic backgrounds. I got very nostalgic because you describe finding, the ISU, the Indian Student Union. They would often table next to the Jewish Student Union. Basically there's a walk at UCLA. It's called Bruin Walk, and all the pick your ethnic group, and we would line up, and there were these little tables. And so I often, would see a lot of the activity. I mean, I'm sure that we, literally crossed paths at some point. But what was it like, kind of your experience at UCLA? Because I would imagine it felt a lot bigger, in some ways than like the town you grew up in.
Yeah. Yeah. I loved UCLA. I was on what we call the 5-year plan. So I took a little longer to graduate. But the reason I loved it so much is leaving high school. The acting bug for me was from middle school. It was because I realized that comedy brought people together, and it was a way of, when somebody it made bullies laugh when they would see school plays. And I just thought the 8th grade version of that brain is now what I realized. I was like, wow, the power to change hearts and minds is pretty incredible. And so that only grew more and more. But my guidance counselor in high school said, when I said, I want to go into the arts, but I also have a passion for public service and international studies. And she goes, well, you can't have your cake and eat it too. And I'm like, what kind of advice is this? This is awful, awful advice. And then I get to UCLA and I realize it's a huge school, there are people from every walk of life. People have multiple interests just by virtue of the type of university it is, right? And I was thriving. I was loving going. I mean, I was the weirdo who took I took LS2. LS2 is a pre-med weeder class at
Those
UCLA.
are our life science core curriculum, which they don't call anymore, but yeah.
Yeah. So that you take that class only if you're going into a science major. I took it as an elective. I failed it, by the way. I had to drop it.
Yeah, that's not like biology for non-science
No.
majors. That's
No.
like real biology, yes.
And I remember I did end up taking the bio for non-science majors in the end, but
Did you study AIDS? Was it the AIDS class or the
it was
cancer
the cancer class. It was the cancer class. That's right. There was an AIDS class and a cancer class. I remember actually sitting in LS2. It was massive, like 400 person lecture, and I missed something the professor said. This must have been the second week, and I asked the kid next to me. I'm like, "Hey, what did she say?" And he covers his notebook and goes, "Don't look at my paper." I'm like, "I'm a film major. We are not competing for med school slots." But no, that was
the only place I have found competition like that is in an audition room. Literally, I mean, I did a pre-med major. I was in class. There were kids, you would literally be just like, "Hey, can you tell me what the assignment was?" And they would turn away as if you were in an audition room and you said, "Hey, do you know how to pronounce this word?" And they would just pretend they did not even hear you. I don't know who it's so competitive and insane. That's your future doctor is what I like to remind people. Like I was in class with everyone who's holding your hand while you die, but they wouldn't give the person next to them the homework assignment.
That's why doctors lack a little bit of social skills.
Yes.
You ended up, I mean, I hate to consolidate. I recommend people read You Can't Be Serious to get the full story. And you're really a lovely storyteller. And it's a very enjoyable journey that you take us on. And also, we get to this point in your kind of young career where I don't want to say it's not enjoyable, but you start coming up against kind of, the reality of your situation, which is that there's, especially at the time that you were auditioning, there's a very specific box that you are supposed to fit into, as a South Asian man.
Yeah.
And, the accent is obviously one of the things that we pay a lot of attention to. And this is not to say that there are not South Asian people with accents. There are. We interact with them all the time. What you kind of came up against with a tremendous amount of bravery, was people kind of repeatedly pushing back and really wanting you to essentially be a caricature. And, as a comedian, I'm sure you would agree, stereotypes exist for a reason, blah, 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 all those things. And still, you got told to shut up a lot.
Yeah.
And you got told to essentially know your place, and that's just kind of what happens, in our industry. But you did finally you had several breaks, in your career. What was sort of that set of journeys like? Because you were, at that point, you're really trying to see, can I support myself as an actor? Can I keep the lights on?
Yeah, right. I think it depends on my definition of success or what I wanted was I just loved storytelling. I loved making people laugh. And if I could pay my rent from acting, that was huge, right? That was going to be a big goal. And I kind of realized early on there was, and I talk about this, I write about this a lot in the book. And then in the audio book, I riffed a little bit on this because I truly enjoyed fact checking all these stories that I tell so much, because the 2020 or 2021 version of me is was it really that fucked up? And then I would call people and not prompt them and just be like, what do you remember about this experience? And I'm like, oh my God, dude, let me tell you this story. And they all checked out. So what I mean by that is, every actor knows, when you're going into this business, there will be times when you don't get auditions or you don't even get a callback because you're too tall, too short, too fat, too skinny, all the things. What I was not well prepared for was realizing that as a performer of color, you oftentimes don't have the luxury of being too tall, too fat, too short, too skinny because you're just too brown, or you're, they have a really narrow vision of what they're looking for with the character. That even to some extent is every actor deals with that. You're signing up for that. If you look like you're a football player from Iowa, you're not getting cast in something that's not the football player from Iowa unless you prove yourself or until you prove yourself. What I wasn't prepared for was all the the stereotypes, and you're 100% right. I say this all the time when people ask about stereotypes, is like, an accent alone does not make a stereotype. A profession, playing a cab driver or a store clerk alone does not make a stereotype. The challenge comes when racial signifiers and things that people use to cover up bad writing is the only essence of a character, right? Because then it becomes about that character's ethnicity or race or any of that. And in addition to just being phenomenally boring, that's also what people mean when they're like, oh, that was kind of racist. So we're talking late 90s here, I would go on auditions and it was always like, oh, can you do that again with an accent? And I would always say things like, oh, sure, what kind of accent do you want? I can do Irish, Brooklyn, Scandinavian, German, and they were never amused by this. By the way, I was like the shit-eating 22-year-old who was trying to school them. They're like, why don't we just stick to Indian? And then in fairness, look, I was the one who made the choice, right? Were there times when I left and didn't want to do it? Of course. But there were also times when I realized I need a credit on my resume. And nobody's forcing me to do this, but maybe I will do an accent. And I remember the show Sabrina the Teenage Witch. Like, I auditioned for this show. I prepped for this thing. It was really only one scene, and I created a whole backstory for the character where he was like from Seattle and liked small batch organic coffee. And I go to the audition. They asked me to do an Indian accent. I did it ultimately. I got the part, and I asked my agent. I was like, "Do you think that you could call them and see if I could do it the way I did the first audition without an accent?" She goes, you're taking the part because it pays $700 and your rent is $550 that month. I'm like, correct. Like, second of all, you know that you're taking this part because you need credits on your resume. I can't pitch you for things if your resume is barren. So why don't you go in a little early, pull the director aside, and just have a conversation with him? So I'm like, oh, I didn't know that was a thing I could do. That would be great. So I go in early, I pull this director aside. I was like, hey, I was just hoping that maybe.
And how old are you? Hold on.
I am, how old? I am probably, 22,
yeah,
23.
Like a pisher. Like a kid. Yeah. Like.
Yeah. And by the way, it's like super skinny. Like for people who, if you got the audiobook, you didn't see the photo, but you can check my Twitter. It is prominently displayed on there. It's just this like very baby faced headshot kid. I probably weighed like 120 pounds. And the director, I was like, I'd love if I could maybe play the part without an accent. What do you think? And he goes, oh, no, I mean, that accent's really funny. That's why we hired you. And so I remember thinking, well, they say that racism comes from ignorance. So maybe I'll just explain to him. So I said, well, you know what? I appreciate this so much. And the show is so funny. And by the way, like, the show was not that funny. It's about a fucking talking cat and witches, right? It's like really low-hanging fruit there. So I buttered him up and I said, I think I would just love to be able to play it without an Indian accent because, I never got to see characters who looked like me on screen.
I'm just like, you must be like, I can't keep going.
Who didn't have, well, I felt like I had nothing to lose, right? So I was like, I never got to see characters like this growing up on screen, and I just thought it would be really, really great if there was a guy who just spoke like I did. And he looks at me like I have asked for the world, and he goes, "No, I said you're doing the accent, and that's what you're going to do." And then I thought, okay, you know what? I'm obviously not explaining it properly. So I said, my cousins, I have little cousins. This was true. I have little cousins.
This is the best part of this story. Go ahead.
They love Sabrina the Teenage Witch. And I think it would be so cool, since they've never seen anyone who looks like them on TV who wasn't a stereotype, if maybe when they watch the show, they get a different experience than the one that I had when I was growing up. And wouldn't that be amazing if, in a show this funny, if they didn't have to watch a stereotype? And he looks at me and he goes, your little cousins should feel lucky that you're allowed to be on TV to begin with, and so should you. And he walks off. And I was like, okay, so it's not ignorance. It is a very calculated, very purposeful thing that people do when they're talking about race representation. And that kind of blew my mind, right? Because you're trained to assume the best in people, or at least until, well, at that time, when you're 22, come on, before you're a cynic, before you realize the ways of the world. And so, look, I did it. It turned out my cousins actually were not fans of the Teenage Witch. They were too smart for that, even at age 8 and 9. But that was a big eye opener for me, because I look, ultimately, like to actually answer your question, which is how do you navigate that? I wanted to make people laugh badly enough. I knew that, or at least I'd hoped that if I banked a certain number of these jobs, one of two things would happen. Either nothing would change in Hollywood and I would end up saying no to a lot and maybe going to law school. Or B, the industry would change. I would have a little more agency with my writing, with my comedy, and having those jobs would lead to better jobs that would break me out of those sorts of stereotypes. The latter ended up being true primarily because of projects like
I like that those were your only two options.
Well, in my head, those were the only two options.
I either become a lawyer or become the man you now know as Kal Penn.
I was very dramatic. I guess I still am.
Was there a timeline in your head? Was there like, I'm going to do this until, and then like, there's like countdown to being a lawyer?
Here's what's crazy. It probably wasn't a lawyer. I probably would have gone to like grad school for international studies or something. But also no. I mean, the thing is, there were a couple of times when I said I wanted to give up, but then wouldn't give up. And there were also times when I had this thing with, I know a lot of actors deal with this, where like, if you're in a rut, you're convincing yourself that you're not getting parts even before you leave the house to go on auditions. It's this weird cycle of just feeling so beaten down by things. And there was a time where I'm like, wait, what am I doing? Why am I not preparing to the best of my ability, going on these auditions, fully expecting that either someone's going to say something racist to me, or it's going to be a room full of like very handsome white boys, and I'm going to convince myself that I don't deserve the part, right? Like full imposter syndrome. And I'm like, why are you doing that? Either like, go get a graduate degree, do something else with your life, or prepare and like go for it no matter what. And I realized I chose the latter because of that insanity that like being an artist, the difference between a hobby or doing summer stock or something like that versus having to do this as your profession is, I think, the difference there, right? Like there's absolutely nothing wrong with the arts as a hobby, and plenty of people do it and they're wonderfully fulfilled. And in my case, it was like, no, I need to do this. I need to do this for my primary career. And I think that's what the big motivator was.
I mean, again, it's like the fact that there's only two choices. How about you assume you won't get the part, know that you're already less attractive than everyone going, I'm just giving you my method.
Yeah.
Assuming that it will be terrible and it will lead to suffering.
Yeah.
And you won't have the option to fall back on anything and you'll all die in the street.
So, okay, Mayim, you are somebody who I have wanted to ask about this because you also juggle many different passions and careers and degrees.
Oh, we haven't even gotten to your other career.
Okay. But I'm curious because the auditioning process is very much like that. And the shit that people say now is very like, it used to be just, it's basically racism or not racism, and then you get the part or don't get the part. And then as I started getting older, it was things like, he's not, in fact, I remember when I think this is a little anecdote in the audiobook, but when we booked Harold Kumar Go to White Castle, the director, the late Danny Liner, who was incredible, he had a party at his house. And a bunch of his drunk friends came, and we all went before we went off to shoot the movie. And this woman who was, she was so drunk, and she came up to me, and I think she was a producer somewhere. She goes, I just want to say congratulations because I told Danny that you were my favorite for the part of Kumar. I said, don't hire that guy who went to UCLA. He's not hot at all. I said, you have to hire the guy from New York. He's so hot. And I'm so glad he hired you. And I'm like, I'm the one from UCLA. So I'm like, in your drunkenness, even though I was the far less hot one who you didn't want hired because I'm not hot, like you even confused us. Like we all look the same, even in your drunkenness. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Anyway, so it was like, as you graduate towards the other reasons you don't get parts, anyway, I'm always super fascinated by other people's stories because you're right. It's like if you don't view the world in binary, then how are you dealing with rejection and success? Like what you just described about just presuming suffering. If I do that, then I feel like I don't get the joy out of the projects that I do book.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm supposed to get joy. I'm sorry. That's not I'm not programmed that way. I don't have that software. They didn't give me, I don't have that app.
I assume you don't go into that movie thinking that this is going to become what it ultimately becomes, which is like a cultural phenomenon.
No, that's right. That audition, I remember, like, I was just so excited. It was the funniest script I'd ever read. I was shocked that I was remotely physically right for a movie like that. I actually remember John Hurwitz and Hayden Schlossberg were acquaintances with somebody I was working with, and so they sent me the script before they sold it. And I remember telling Hurwitz, hey man, you're not going to sell this movie unless you change the ethnicity of the characters. I've had several friends who have tried to tell South Asian stories or cast South Asian characters. It's just not going to happen. So I don't know what your plan is, but if you choose not to change the ethnicity of the characters, let me know. Like, my dad knows a bunch of rich cardiologists. Like, maybe we can raise some VC money and we can shoot this thing independently. And he goes, first of all, we're making Harold and Kumar go to White Castle. I'm not trying to make a movie called David and Jason Go to McDonald's. And number two, we're selling it to a major studio. So thank you, but no, we're selling it. And I'm like, you're not. You're never going to sell this thing. I know. I've been around for 8 years or 10 years, whatever it was at the time. I'm like, you're not going to sell it. And a week and a half later, he calls me back and goes, hey, we sold it to a company called Senator. New Line Cinema's distributing it with Warner Brothers as the parent company, or maybe Warner wasn't the parent yet. But that was like, and then we started this very aggressive, there's never a shortage of performers to fit a specific role. That always tends to be like the studio's excuse for lack of diversity. It's like, well, where would we find the parents? Like, but you would have to open your eyes a little bit and go with a list that you haven't used before. But so, they audition people everywhere, like New York, Sydney, Chicago, LA, obviously, and we got those parts and just thought, we're so excited. It's this small independent film. The movie comes out, it tanks at the box office. Everybody always forgets this. Like, it barely made it for its initial week or two run, whatever they promised distributors. And then we were devastated. I mean, we were sort of like, this proved, I remember actually having this conversation that there were people who said, Hollywood's not ready or America's not ready for a buddy comedy or a comedy that has two Asian American men as the leads. And I was convinced, obviously, they were ready. I was like, I know people who laugh at the lame jokes I make. And then when it didn't do well, we thought, like, could that be true? Did the executives really know what they were talking about? I think it was something like 6 months later, it comes out on DVD and on HBO, and people started gifting it to each other and having watch parties. And it wasn't just like New York, San Francisco, LA. It was like Oklahoma and Iowa and all of these places in the middle of the country, because as it turns out, yes, people love to laugh no matter what the characters look like, as long as the script is solid. And it was this, like, whenever you hear us talking about our fans, it's with such reverence because they've given us this incredible franchise.
I wish I could tell you that everyone I meet in Hollywood is as articulate and intelligent and eloquent as Kal Penn, but it is unusual to meet people who want to kind of like talk and think and connect like you do. And you had a very serious role in the Obama administration and ended up kind of balancing two careers, both of which were, phenomenal in their own right. And you did this like crazy, like jet setting thing and were, this enormous part of an administration that you also believed very deeply in, as it aligned with a lot of your kind of family history and sort of politics.
How many times did you high five Obama?
Well, can I just start by saying, Mayim, thank you. I feel the same way about you. I love what we do in the creative space, but it's always really refreshing when you're working with somebody or talking to somebody who also has a background or an expertise in something else. Because that whether it's a love of life or a neuroses or whatever it is that makes us who we are, I really enjoy those conversations. And the biggest takeaway probably, like when I went off to go work at the White House, and for folks who don't know the story, obviously it's in the audiobook in the book in a longer way, but I was volunteering for the Obama campaign. That was actually, you know what? I'm going to tell you the story because your listeners are nerds like we are, and I mean that with love because we are from the same people in that sense. So the reason I ended up volunteering for the Obama campaign to begin with, and this was October of 2007. So if you follow politics, this was before the Iowa caucuses. It's the fall after the summer in which Obama was down 30 points in the polls leading up to the Iowa caucuses. So everybody sort of said, this guy's obviously not a viable candidate. The Democratic primary is going to be won by either Hillary Clinton or John Edwards. And and I was working on the TV show House at the time, and Olivia Wilde, who's one of my coworkers, had a +1 to this Obama event. And she goes, "Hey, do you want to come?" And I'm like, "No, I'm good." She goes, "Well, it's a pretty intimate event. It's going to be 50 artists or so. He's going to ask if people will help him volunteering in Iowa before the Iowa caucuses." And I was like, "No, I don't really have any interest." She goes, "Well, I saw you reading his book." And I was like, "Well, yeah, I read a lot. It doesn't mean I want to go." Like, you know how politicians work in LA. They come
Sure.
through, they make a speech, they ask for money, they say what people want to hear. And then they're totally different when either the cameras disappear or they're being chummy with people who wrote them big checks. Like, I have no desire to experience any of this. And I think she must have said something like, "Well, I mean, it's an open bar." And I was like, "Sweet, I'm in." So before going to this Obama event, I'm like, let me, if it's an artist event, people are obviously going to ask questions about arts funding and arts education. I want to ask a question that's different. So I go on his campaign's website and I'm reading about climate change. And I was like, okay, I'm reading about how Obama's plan is to invest in biofuels and how much corn we have to produce to turn into ethanol. And I remembered, this also shows you what a nerd I am, I remembered an article that I'd read a couple of months prior in a magazine called Foreign Affairs.
Like you do. It's what we
Like
all
you
read.
do, like one
Just,
does, yes. The big, thick blue.
It's on my night table.
Yeah, exactly, right. And I remember that article said something about how if we invest heavily in corn to turn into ethanol, it can drive the price of corn up for people who rely on it for food in developing countries because the marketplace won't differentiate between corn for industrial production and human consumption. So I'm like, well, boom, there's my question, right? So I'm at this event.
Who wouldn't think that? Who wouldn't have that question come to them?
So I'm maybe 3 glasses of wine in. Olivia and I are standing next to each other. Obama's making the rounds, and he introduces himself. And I was like, Senator, I have a question about your climate change proposal. And he looks at me. He's like, "Oh, all right." And I said, I read that you're investing in corn to turn into ethanol for fuel, but isn't that just going to raise the price of corn for people who rely on it for food in developing countries? And he kind of gives me this like half cocky smirk that I think we all know at this point. And he goes, "Oh yeah, I read that article in Foreign Affairs too." If you had read my campaign proposal carefully, you would have seen that I'm investing in corn-based ethanol as a bridge to cellulosic ethanol so that we can, one day make clean energy from things like our grass clippings and raking the leaves in your yard. And he gives me another one of the smirks and walks off. And Olivia's like, "You just got schooled by Senator Obama." And I had that brief moment of like, at what point did that combination of hubris and just artistic nonsense meet for me to say, maybe I know more than someone who sits on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee?
You're kind of cocky. You're
Right?
kind of a cocky guy.
Right when it came to that, I was like, "Oh, come on, it's a room full of fellow actors. I'm going to ask a smarty pants question." No, I did not. I failed miserably. Anyway, Olivia and I both signed up to volunteer for Obama that evening. And that's kind of what launched going to 26 different states on behalf of the campaign. That when you start, and this goes for any political campaign, whether somebody's running for president or local city council, if you join the campaign early enough and the campaign sort of picks up steam and grows, it grows sort of concentric circles. So you're trusted with executing things on behalf of the candidate as the campaign grows bigger and bigger. So by the time he had won the presidency, there was an opportunity to serve at the White House. That story really came together because of Michelle Obama, who hazed me into taking a job, essentially, which I appreciated very much. But I get to the White House. Very long-winded way of saying the thing that I didn't fully appreciate. I go off to do this thing. I didn't realize it was going to become a news story, perhaps naively. And the reason I didn't realize that is because thousands of other people literally were doing the exact same thing that I was doing, right? We live in the type of democracy where people take leaves of absence from their private sector jobs all the time, or from academia. Some of them are CEOs or lawyers, or, there was a pediatrician in my office, somebody who worked at a clean energy company. That's a thing that people do. They do it obviously for the executive branch, but they do it in every iteration of public service. And I was so inspired by being around those people. And I was like, there should be stories about all of them. Like, what if I was a law student and didn't know that was a thing that I could do? So it was a very special time, I think, I was there the first 2.5 years of the administration when things were far less vitriolic than I think our politics are today, 10 years later. But it really floored me, and it floored me in what I still consider a positive sense of like, oh, here's a playbook of sorts and how we can actually make a difference if we use the right pressure points.
Obviously when we worked together, when I got to meet you and spend some time, on Big Bang Theory, like you seem like a very affable guy. Like you're a nice person and, you make eye contact. I know it sounds silly, but for people who, don't spend a lot of time in these arenas, like just people making eye contact can be like, oh my gosh, this is like a person who wants to have a connection.
Yeah.
So that was very refreshing. But even just talking to you today and, getting to know you a little better through the book and through here, you seem very well adjusted. And I'm happy for you. And I guess I'm curious, like, do you have a religious practice? Do you have a spiritual practice? Do you have are you like I exercise or like, here are the things that keep, like, I would imagine that everybody has challenges and things, but like, you just seem to have a very kind of good disposition.
Thank you. It's funny when I heard the intro to that question is literally my experience walking into the Big Bang Theory. I felt that way. I'm like, oh my gosh, holy shit! These people are all super friendly and they genuinely are like having a great time and they seem to actually like each other. And I was only on for a couple episodes. I'm like, they're welcoming us. This is what, and they're on their way out. The season's done. The show, this incredible run is over. There's no need for them to be nice to us. And it was just about like really enjoying the craft. I'm not particularly religious. I mentioned how our grandparents' view of religion and faith was very secular, very inclusive. And I definitely take part of that with me where for me, it's more of it's always a shame when faith is used to divide people as opposed to kind of be a respected thing that we learn from together. But no, I don't think there's any sort of thing like that aside from, I don't know how hokey this sounds, but none of us know how much time we've got. And I love to live every day doing things that I love with people I love. I love getting to know folks and talk to them and learn from them and wish the best of people who I meet, unless they ask me to do stereotypical accents on Sabrina the Teenage Witch.
Jonathan, let's talk about him like he's not here. What is this person?
This is funny that you're doing this because I also wanted to talk about him like he's not here because he said that he thinks the best of people and that we're supposed to do that.
It's like he's speaking a different language. He's bilingual.
It's very hard to do sometimes, but it seems as though, Kal, you have actually done that where you have really incorporated this. I had a boss who did this at one point. I was, much younger. I was managing an apartment complex and there were like really bad people at this apartment complex that you knew did bad things. And this manager, he just like, at every turn, he's like, well, maybe they had something else going on. He just like always had this lens of positivity and it made him much less stressed.
Let me then interject with, I am also from New Jersey. I will fucking cut you if I think that you've wronged me or wronged somebody who I love. So I am definitely not the Eeyore of the like, or the Winnie the Pooh, whatever, the like, oh, everything's fine. Oh, maybe they just had a bad day. Like, yeah, sure, put yourself in other people's shoes. But what you're describing, like chronic manipulation of fellow humans, no, fuck you, dude. We do not. You should sit next to me when I'm like watching the news in the morning, right? It's not this person. It's not the we can all be better together person.
But have you ever like been depressed?
Yes, of course.
I mean, obviously everybody gets sad, but like, have you had periods of your life where you were like, oh, this is a challenge. Like I should go to therapy or like I need medication. Like, have those things ever happened to Kal Penn?
Yeah. One of the things I'm so glad people talk about so openly now than when we were in college even was like, hey, I think I need help processing something that I'm dealing with. I should go see a therapist for 10 sessions. Or I should really focus on my mental and emotional health. Some of that for me was definitely navigating being a young performer of color and trying, sort of being confused by what that was like. And that really just, what you realize now is like that merger between a love for the arts that you realize is also commerce. So how do you navigate those spaces? But no, I definitely, I've seen therapists in the past when I thought that was helpful. And I certainly encourage people to do it. And I'm glad there's like, that's a resource that people talk about more openly. today than they did a decade ago. But I also think it's when I say that outlook or that viewpoint, that I try to, or I it's not that I'm assuming the best in anybody. It's that I'm trying to find what that commonality is. So the notion that, it used to be that we would all think like, well, someone's political views differ from mine, but they still care about the same things. They want their kid to go to a good school. They want their kid to be able to go to college and live in a neighborhood where they feel safe. That's actually not true, right? Like, we realized that wasn't true over the last 8 years when people are voting against education funding or saying, well, I don't want that person in my community. So I think for people who, and I put myself in this category, who thought, oh, we all want the same things, it was actually quite jarring to realize that maybe wasn't true. So I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that the other part of that human connection, which is what makes you happy, what makes you tick, what do you love? No matter how vitriolic or awful somebody is, I remain fascinated by what are the things that they actually love or find passion in life. I don't know if that's like a weirdness or if I'm like too empathetic or if it's the artist in me, but that's sort of one of the things I love about meeting people.
I am curious, how do you deal emotionally when you are watching the news, when you talk about like that rage and what's happened now in terms of where we are as a country and how divisive things have gotten? Like, how do you personally deal with that?
Yeah, I think like most people, it kind of depends on the day, but I always try to remind myself that the systems that we live in, whether it's, business or democracy or public service, a lot of them are designed to make you feel complacent, to foster this complacency that allows people in positions of power to maintain that power. And it's wild how that works, right? Like, we'll turn on the news and think, well, I can't possibly help what's happening in the world, so why bother? Or, oh, I read that it's too hard to register to vote, so why bother? Or any small thing, even in your own community, like, oh, I'll never be able to make a difference. And that fostering is then a self-fulfilling prophecy. It means that we're never going to be able to do things. So I think it's accepting that you, of course, can't change everything, but the idea that we can actually make an impact in certain ways, and that it's not a light switch. It's I think, especially as the years go on and we're so used to getting all our information immediately, like I can find out what's happening in Ukraine literally right now on my phone, and it'll be different than when we started our conversation. That's helpful in some ways, but it's also remarkably frustrating when you're talking about how systems can and do change. This is one of the subtexts of my book, is how do systems change, whether it's something like Hollywood, which I love deeply, and I so deeply love what we do as entertainers, or something like working in the federal government. There are 3 branches of government. They operate slowly on purpose. You're not supposed to have a dictatorship. That means that people are incredibly frustrated, especially people under 30 who don't know what it's like to live without email or digital devices where you can get access to information immediately. So I think it's just reminding myself that the system's designed to make you feel frustrated, but to have that frustration and to accept it and to work through it, but then focus on what was the thing that bummed you out and what's the solution to that? There's so many people doing really great work. Like, I might be passionate about something. It doesn't mean I need to start a nonprofit. There are fucking 100 nonprofits for the thing that I'm passionate about who already do really good work. Why don't I partner with them? Why don't I give them a hand? So that's kind of my outlook on it, I guess. You kind of caught me off guard because I haven't thought that through. It's one of those things that's just like, how do you deal day to day? And I'm just thinking about even the last couple of days, how I've processed that kind of stuff.
So something that was kind of missing from your book, which I actually found kind of refreshing that it didn't need to be part of the book. You don't talk really about sexuality or, kind of like a lot of memoirs, like you hear about like first crush or like blah, 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 or like dating. And it's not like I was like needing it. But I do think it's interesting. You've kind of talked about being, sort of a late bloomer. But I guess I am curious, as much or as little as you like to talk about it. You are engaged, correct?
Yep.
And you've been with your partner for over a decade. This is a long relationship. Was that something that you've chosen kind of to keep separate from your public identity? Was it a combination of just like, it's none of your business, or gosh, what an interesting time to be a gay person who's alive. Like, I'm curious if it was part of your consciousness also as a kid or as a teenager.
Definitely, yeah, no, and I appreciate that question. I was not somebody who was struggling with their sexuality as a kid, and so part of it, I wouldn't say it was a conscious decision to include or exclude anything from the book. It was, but I was also mindful, like when it comes to a lot of the racial diversity pieces, I was mindful that the story that a lot of people's stories with their own sexuality or identity is not my story, and I didn't want to make it seem like their story was not important, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. There are also phenomenal books on LGBT experiences from perspectives that deal with what I think a lot of people might be dealing with. My friend Cheston Buttigieg had a memoir that came out last year, and it's phenomenal. And he and I were talking. I was like, dude, you literally, like, there's this great story in the beginning of his book about his steer. Like, he had a cow that he had to take care of. He grew up in rural Michigan, and just had like the dichotomy of that versus some of the sexuality that he was dealing with. That wasn't necessarily my experience. I think probably because I grew up outside of New York City as well. So there was there wasn't, I think, the sort of stigma at the same level. But look, I also, like you said, I was a late bloomer. I kind of discovered my own sexuality relatively late in life. I think I mentioned that in an interview after the book came out, because I was naively, I didn't think, chapter 18, where I talk about how my partner Josh and I met, and we met ridiculously over like our second date. So this is when I was living in DC, and I was supposed to, your Sundays are like the only days that you don't really have to go into work. And so I was like, look, man, I can't really hang Saturday night, but like Sunday afternoon, if you want to like come over, we can have a beer and watch TV or something. So I remember he comes over. I had SpongeBob SquarePants on my TV because I'm a romantic.
Like you do.
Yes, one does. And he comes over with an 18-pack of Coors Light and like turns my TV on to a NASCAR race, like with no sense of irony for either things. And I was like, oh, this dude's obviously leaving in 20 minutes with like 16 of those beers, because this is not how I'm spending my afternoon. And so I tell the story about this like essentially second date gone wrong, and then how we ended up connecting off of a conversation about NASCAR and family. And then the book comes out, and I didn't realize that there was going to be all this attention on our relationship or even my sexuality. I mean, I remember when we shot Big Bang Theory, like, he came to a taping, and I remember you and Jim were like, "Oh, your dude's here. Which one is he?" And we're like peeking out through the little pieces between the set. I'm like, the guy with the baseball hat. It's like the one on the top. I'm like, no, the one 3 rows down. Like, oh, he's handsome. I'm like, thank you very much. I know, right? But he's a quiet guy. He shies away from the limelight. He's not an actor. He doesn't have a public profession. And so when we started dating, I was sort of like, oh, I want to be respectful of his privacy too. And it's very similar actually to my parents' approach to my career, where they've always been super supportive. They've always met my coworkers and friends, and I've never, like I was hiding my parents from people. But when we would go to premieres, and it's the same with Josh, when he would come to work events where there's a red carpet, he and my parents and my brother, when he's around, they do this dance where like the car pulls up, they hop out, they go through the side entrance. They're like, we're going to grab popcorn and we will see you at the seats. And usually like a publicist or even me, I'll be like, can we just do like one picture like before we all go in? Like, no, you do whatever interviews you need to do and we'll see you inside. And so I've always respected that about him, about my parents. And so, yeah, I guess I didn't realize that maybe the perception of sharing those stories, which I'm very excited to share with people in the book, I didn't realize that there was a version of that perception that was like, oh, unless you're talking actively about your partner, the presumption is that you're deeply closeted. And I'm like, oh, well, that was also not my experience, right? And again, no disrespect to people who have struggled with that as well, but my experience has been just a lot more straightforward.
Did you date women? Was there a time when you dated female people?
Yeah, I dated women earlier, probably in high school and college, but and then later dated dudes. And it's funny, I remember actually when I started dating men, and I thought, oh, well, LA's a tricky city to date in, period, no matter who you're dating. And I remember I've had one manager my entire career. It was a wonderful guy named Dan Spilo, who especially early on really helped navigate a lot of the racial barriers to entry. And so I remember calling him and being like, "Hey, so I'm dating some dudes. Like, what's the deal in LA? Like, how do you date
I'm
dudes?
dating some dude.
How do you meet some good dudes to date in LA?" And he was like, well, I mean, I don't know. Like, I guess you can't really go on Craigslist. And I'm like, no, can't. It's like, this was pre-apps. He's like, you can't really do online stuff. Let me ask. And he there was like a friend of a friend of a friend. There was a producer he knew. And he goes, why don't you grab dinner with this producer? And, he's gay. You can pick his brain. I'm like, okay, sure. So I remember this so vividly. I grabbed dinner with this producer, and he was super awkward. He was like, "So I understand you need some advice. You have some questions for me." I was like, "Oh, I mean, well, I just want, like, how do people date in LA? Like, it's LA's super awkward. Like, how do I meet some good dudes?" He goes, "Well, listen, you don't have anything to worry about." He was an older guy. I'm gonna send you a list. And I was like, "Oh, matchmaker right away! Like, you're just gonna send me a list?" He's like, "Yeah, I'll send you a list, of guys you might like, And I'm like, "Well, that's wonderful, thank you." And he goes, "Well, no, I mean, look, they'll do whatever you want. They're not that expensive, and they're never gonna say anything, so you don't have to worry."
Oh,
I'm like,
you got
whoa.
connected with like the underground gay mafia.
Essentially. And I'm like, buddy, no disrespect to sex workers at all, but that's not what I'm looking for. That's not what this conversation is.
Right.
This conversation is like, how do I meet a handsome guy to, like, date properly, like go have dinner and watch a basketball game and like all the things you do when you're dating somebody. And he goes, "Oh, well, I don't know anything about that. All I'm saying is, like, you can hire some of these guys. They'll never tell anybody that you're together." And I'm like,
this was literally why Palm Springs was built, for these kind of liaisons.
Right. And so what was crazy to me, there are a million reasons why I live in New York and not LA, but what was crazy to me about this was, I'm like, this feels so toxic. I'm not asking for advice on how to hide a part of my life. I'm asking for advice on how to have a wonderful dating life in a city where I hadn't had one before, and where I'm discovering something about myself that I would like to explore. And so it was like, it was just such a bonkers, like, and again, I can't imagine how many people that's their experience, and maybe that's a bridge to figuring themselves out. That, again, that wasn't my story. I sort of rejected that bad advice and was like, oh, when I visit friends in New York and DC and Chicago, I meet great guys, and I'll go out on a date here or there. My question was literally, how does that work in a driving city?
Right.
Like when you're not taking the subway
and
to meet somebody.
also in LA, where you can be, a 10 anywhere in the country, and when you land here, you're a 3. Like, that's just how it is. Is Josh South Asian?
He's not.
Did he have a bar mitzvah?
He did not have a bar mitzvah. He's from a small town in Mississippi.
Wow.
Yeah. So I don't know that there were any bar mitzvahs happening down there. I think they're, I'm not even joking about this. I think the town cardiologist may have been South Asian, but that was about it.
Great. Thank you so much. It's really been a delight to talk to you, and thank you for sharing your time, your story. You Can't Be Serious is the book. Also, I'd just like to mention the advance praise, again, I wasn't asked, Mindy Kaling, Ronan Farrow, Andy Samberg, Rob Gronkowski, Kiefer Sutherland, Tony Shalhoub, and David Axelrod. Very, very impressive praise for a very impressive gentleman. So really, really, thank you so much. Mazel tov on your engagement, and we wish you only good things.
I would love to say thank you to both of you. This was a real treat. I was looking forward to this for months. Mayim, I really enjoyed when we had the chance to hang out in LA and work together. And I love talking to you. I've loved this conversation. Thanks for all the love on the book. I hope people like it. There's also the audiobook that you can download. And I love that you shouted out all the random collection of friends who were kind enough to offer a blurb on the back.
You've got some fancy friends. It's very fancy.
Obviously reaching out to you for the second book blurb if
she'll be waiting.
And I will say no, because you didn't ask me about the first one. Okay. Jonathan, I have a very serious question to ask you.
Okay, go.
What are the 3 branches of the U.S. government? I'm only asking because you're not American. What are they?
You love to put me on
You
the
don't know.
spot.
You don't have to know these things. Kal Penn knows. That's a very smart individual.
Is that what people say about you?
No.
They think you're all sciencey. They think
No.
you know so many things. Then I have to tell them you
just-
don't know that many things. You just say you know a lot of things.
Yeah, anyone who likes me or compliments me, I say to them, you should talk to Jonathan Cohen. He'll tell you.
Let
the
me
real
set
story.
you guys straight. No, I don't say that. Because
No,
your fans
I
will
mean,
then
I
gang up
just
on me.
also like there's something about that man's DNA that makes him happier than I am.
Yes, absolutely. There is 100% something genetically that he has a higher level of optimism.
He
than
has
you
a
do.
higher level, and I'm being totally serious. Like there are, and I'm not. People are gonna be like, "Are you saying that all South Asian people?" No, I'm saying that person, his threshold is just different. It's just different than mine.
With different childhood experiences, different genetic makeup, different level of programmed anxiety.
Yeah, but I kind of feel like if he was raised in my house, if my parents had adopted Kal Penn, I feel like he might still be like, no, he wouldn't have a chance. He wouldn't have a fighting chance.
No, I think he'd be far more anxious than he is now.
He just seems really chill.
I like that he gets angry at the news. That's helpful.
He's I mean, you can hear it in the book also. And I'm sure in the audio, but I did the reading version. He's very passionate. He's very intense,
Yeah.
but he's so articulate. So like even when he gets upset, it's like he can lay you low with his words. Like even about political things. Like
You get a level of that type of articulation when you're surrounded by people who are speaking about interesting things, and being able to be immersed in the political environment and surrounded by, as he said, all these people who are taking time away from other areas. That type of exposure definitely breeds a level of intellectual curiosity and
also I think
intelligence.
I think the way he grew up, right? Just his parents sound very compassionate
He's very
and
curious.
Yeah.
That's the other thing, and we talk a lot about how curiosity impacts our overall outlook and our overall
It also
mood.
killed the cat.
What's that?
Curiosity killed the cat. That's an American expression.
Yes, I know that expression. I just didn't understand it out of your mouth. It sounded strange. He has a high level of curiosity. He wants to know about different things. He's not totally frustrated with the fact that the systems are broken. He thinks that that's a positive thing to help propel change, and that they're designed so that it prevents dictatorship. Like even that outlook is beneficial.
I'm very taken with people like that because like there's a combination of like admiration and kind of like envy for a worldview that I really I just like, I feel like, can't I just will myself to just be so chill?
If you were around him more, you would. You have to surround yourself by like-minded
He
people.
wouldn't even
'cause
marry
it's a
me.
Feedback.
He's with a man. He doesn't even want me.
Before we went into this interview, I had a question that I really wanted to ask him, which was that does he have any future political aspirations? Now, he wouldn't have told
I could see him running
us
for president.
honestly. I could see him in a political arena, and I was going to just seed the idea that maybe you two had a ticket together somewhere.
No. You know why? Because he didn't mention the patriarchy once, and I hold that against him. That's really what Mayim and Bialik's breakdown is about. It's trying to find people for our political cadre. We're building our
That's
cabinet.
right. The best thing about that interview for me was the story about how he was very patiently trying to convince and explain to the producer why he shouldn't do the accent.
It's honestly, it's very funny in here as well. It is.
And as he's telling that story, I'm thinking of every single time you and I have had a difference of opinion about anything. And my approach to that is just to explain my side more and more and more. And it has never worked once. Do you have an example of when I've tried to like just double down on an explanation of why I think something should be the way it should be?
No, but you and a previous person that I knew who I dated would say one of your favorite sentences. What part of that don't you understand? I'll be like, I don't understand. I'll say like, I don't understand. That's your approach to trying to help me understand things.
I'll say, I'm really tired tonight. You'll say, I don't understand. And then I say, I'm not sure what there is to not understand about I'm very tired tonight.
That's not true. Jonathan, that was very enjoyable. I'm glad you got to meet Kal Penn with me.
I loved it. And if people want to hang out with us more, they can check out the Instagram page, Bialik Breakdown. If you haven't already followed the show, subscribe anywhere you get podcasts and check out Mayim's YouTube page. Click the little bell notification to get more.
Okay, from our breakdown to the one we hope you never have. We'll see you next time.
It's Mayim and Bialik's breakdown. She's gonna break it down for you. She's got a neuroscience PhD or two. One fiction, and now she's gonna break down